Good evening, scholars, family, and friends. Welcome to Night at the Museum, a U.S. History EOC Review event. My name is Matthew Bloom, and I'm the High School Social Studies Content Specialist for Pinellas County Schools. We're here tonight at the James Museum in St. Petersburg as part of our PCS Connects Level Up initiative to help you get ready for the U.S. History End of Course exam. We're joined tonight by Helen Huntley, who is a docent here at the museum, and she's going to be our expert to help us dive into the painting that's behind us. Before we get started with our review, we have a special message from Julie Matus, who is the Director of Education and Public Programs here at the museum. Let's hear from Julie.
Good evening, students and families. My name is Julie Matus, and I'm part of the education team here at the James Museum of Western and Wildlife Art. We want to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this night at the museum. We're happy to collaborate with Pinellas County Schools in helping to prepare students for the U.S. History course exam this May. The James Museum features art that tells stories, past and present, about the American West. Our galleries showcase more than 400 pieces of art that approach subjects from multiple points of view. Works by Native American and non-Native artists are represented in our collection. This evening, you will see and hear about a contemporary work of art that depicts the past. Through his painting, Dark Day on the Plains, artist David York tells a small part of a big and complicated story of manifest destiny, steamrolling westward through the American plains. Tonight, your visit is virtual, but we hope you will come and see us in person in the near future. I want to thank our docent educator, Helen Huntley, for her part in leading the discussion tonight. Please enjoy.
Thank you, Julie. For our scholars watching tonight, we want to take a moment and review the benchmark that we're going to focus on for the dive into this painting behind us. We're going to focus on benchmark A.2.7, which is to review the Native American experience. Specifically, we're going to focus a little bit on settlement patterns in the American West. We'll touch on the reservation system, but we're going to spend some time talking about the tribulations of Native Americans from 1865 to 1890. The content that's important to listen for that will help you on the EOC: things like westward expansion, the Homestead Act, government involvement in the killing of the buffalo, boarding schools or Indian schools, the reservation system, and the concept of assimilation. If you have a question during this live stream event, you can submit it to the email address pcssocial@pcsb.org. Just know that we won't have time to get to all of your questions, but we'll do the best that we can. So Helen, tonight we're standing in front of the painting Dark Day on the Plains by David York. Before we get into the painting itself, what can you tell us about the artist?
Well, David York is a Floridian, just like we are. He grew up in South Florida, and he lives now in Claremont, a little bit northeast of us. He studied advertising design at the University of Florida, and he became a commercial artist. Then he got a great break in his career when he got a job with Disney Studios, painting backdrops for animated films, one of which was Mulan, which some of you may have seen. And then after that, he decided to devote himself to fine art, and specifically art related to scenes and people of the West. Now, since we know that he's alive now, we know that he was not alive at the time when a painting like this is depicting. So this is a scene that is showing us the West after the Civil War, so it would have been late 1860s, early 1870s. Well, so how would he know what it was like then? Like many of our contemporary artists, he did a lot of research about the West, and then he used his imagination to bring scenes of the early West alive for us today. He would go out west often, and he collected period clothing and artifacts, and sometimes he would even make clothing, and then he would hire models to pose in different positions wearing the clothing. And in fact, for a painting like this, he told us that he took many pictures of the bison, and he also, in order to have a picture of the train, since he didn't have access to an old locomotive like that, he actually got a model train and photographed it. And then working with all of these digital pictures, he would put them into a computer, and through the magic of computer science, he would be able to manipulate it and create a montage. And when he had everything outlined exactly the way he wanted it in his computer, then he would paint it. So that's his process of when he would work on a beautiful oil painting like this.
That's awesome. And it has a great connection with our benchmark that we're going to review tonight. we want to give those of you at home that are watching us the chance to dive deep into this painting and look at some of the detail that's there. And we're going to do that through a thinking routine known as the explanation game. The purpose of this routine is to help with understanding why something is the way it is. This routine gets at a causal explanation, it could get at an explanation in terms of purpose, or it can get at both. The routine focuses on identifying something interesting about an object or an idea, in our case, elements of the painting. You can make or you can write down on your own an I notice statement, and you follow that up with an observation, or you follow up that observation with a question. Why is it that way? Why does it happen that way? What do we think is going on? In a few moments, we're going to give you the chance to dive in and look at this painting deeply. You're going to make I notice statements, and you're going to pose questions. But there's an additional challenge tonight, because you're obviously not here with us face to face for that open dialogue. So what we want you to do is we want you to attempt to explain your own observations and questions before we begin the debrief, because you have all heard these concepts before in your U.S. history classes. So before we get you underway, Helen and I wanted to model an example for you. And the model we wanted to use is, Helen, when we're looking at this painting, I noticed that there are a lot of bison in the painting, but that they're also very close to the train itself. Why is it that way? What can you tell us about this particular piece?
Well, that's because there were a whole lot of bison, millions of them wandering through the plains back during this time period. In fact, from the beginning of the 1800s, there was something like 25 to 30 million bison. And people who went west during that time period would say that it would take riding horseback several days to pass through one of these herds because they were so huge. And the bison were free to wander just wherever they wanted to. They would go where the grass was growing, so during times when there was a lot of grass, there were more bison. During times of drought, there were fewer. And around this time, after the Civil War, there were maybe half as many as there had been at the beginning of the 1800s, but there were still a lot of bison, millions, somewhere 15 million. And then they could go wherever they wanted. So they didn't realize that the train tracks were something dangerous, because the train was something new and they weren't really conditioned to know that it was a dangerous thing. And if you will notice, the locomotive there in the front has this V-shaped device, which is called a cowcatcher or a pilot. And its purpose is to push the bison or any other animals or obstacles off the track so that they don't injure the train and cause it to have a derailment.
All right. And scholars, something else that's important to remember about this time is that in May of 1862, the Homestead Act is going to accelerate the settlement of the Western Territory by granting adult heads of family 160 acres of land for a small filing fee. The incentive to move and settle on the Western Territory resulted in millions of claims, but far fewer deeds were ever actually obtained. One of the consequences of this expansion was that it stripped the Native Americans on this land of their land and the natural resources. So that's a sample of how you could go about this thinking routine. Now it's time to give you a try to do this on your own. We're going to give you about 2 minutes to look closely at the painting, and we're going to use our explanation game routine. So I noticed that, and why is that important? Try to make 3 to 5 I noticed statements and try to explain what you know about the time period, thinking about what you've already learned in class and about the period of westward expansion that we're talking about tonight. now that you've had a brief moment to reflect on the painting and the details that you see within it, Hal and I are going to use that same explanation game routine to help process some of the things that you probably noticed. As we do this, remember, if you have an observation or you have a question from this, you can submit it through the email address pcssocial@pcsb.org. So Helen, the first and one of the easiest observations to make is that it looks like this train is passing through the middle of nowhere. Why is that like that at this point in time?
Well, back then there, of course, were not many trains at all during the earlier part of the 1800s, but then this became a whole movement to build train tracks across the West. And the Transcontinental Railroad was built and finished in 1869, connecting the cities east of the Mississippi River with California. Well, that's a long way. That's about 2,000 miles. And in between, there's a whole lot of plains and empty spaces. And as the train tracks spread further west, many subordinate lines would connect with them. So that made it possible then to reach the train and to go west, which encouraged people to go west and settle. And the difference it made in transportation was amazing. So before the Transcontinental Railroad came through, it would take the wagon train like 6 months to get across, and it would be very dangerous. Then the stagecoach came along, and that would be about 1 month. And then when the train came, you could go in maybe 4 days. So it made a big difference. And not only could people come west, but they could also send things back west. So cattle, for example, and their farm produce could go back to the east, so it created a market for their goods. So it really extended the reach of the east to the west. And the only thing is, this prairie is empty, but it's not unoccupied. There were the bison, of course, and the Native Americans who were living out in the prairies.
Thank you. And for our scholars, it's important to remember that the opening of the Transcontinental Railroad rapidly expands the settling in the West. But at the same time, it's going to increase or escalate the conflict between the Native American tribes that are on the plains already and the settlers who are moving out west for opportunities. Helen, the next observation, or the things that we might have noticed, is that David York was deliberate about putting in the smoke on the train. What does that tell us, and what do we know about the time period and the technology that's used here?
Okay, well, this is a locomotive. It's different from the kind of locomotives on trains today. It's a steam-powered locomotive, but in order to create the steam, you had to burn a hard fuel, such as wood or coal, and burning that fuel then would boil the water, which then would create the pressurized smoke, which would be used to power the wheels, the brakes, the whistles, and other devices on the train. So we see the smoke is telling us how the train is moving. But also, as David York put this in, it's showing that the train is moving, that it's not stationary. So we can see by the big trailing smoke that it's going, that it's being powered. And you can see the direction that the train is kind of coming from and the way that the wind is blowing.
So, Helen, one of the things that everyone probably noticed immediately was the men on the train, the men out the doors, the men out the windows, the men on top who are firing into the buffaloes. What is taking place here in this moment?
Right, these men who were on this train shooting the bison were part of a big wave of white men who came west specifically to kill the buffalo, and there were the bison. Buffalo, of course, is just a common name that we use. The animal is actually the bison. And by the end of the 1800s, they had been so successful that there were maybe 500 to 1,000 out of the millions of buffalo that were still alive. The initial reason they were doing this was for profit. The early hunters were known specifically as hide hunters. They were there to, they would actually kill the buffalo in the field, take the hide, and leave the carcass to rot. And then these hides could be shipped back east, and they could be made into leather products, including they would be used to make belts for the industrial machines back east.
So, Helen, were there any other reasons for the killing of the buffalo? What else plays into something like this taking place?
Well, one of the other major factors really was hostility toward the Indians. That, you know, these people had no love lost for the Indians, and they knew that the Indians depended on the bison for their food. So they were fighting the Indians. The Indian Wars were going on at that time. The Indians were trying to defend their way of life against all these settlers coming in, and they were attacking settlements of both Mexican and white, and they were attacking trains and so forth. So they were getting revenge, and they saw themselves in some ways as being kind of patriotic heroes. The Army even sent William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan, two generals, to do what they call pacify the plains, and that is to bring peace through military force. So the hunters said, oh, we're just helping out the military, we're patriotic. One of them, John Cook, even said in his memoirs that General Sheridan had told the Texas legislature that we should praise hunters for destroying the Indians' commissary or food supply, and that they ought to be thanked for what they did. This speech was widely quoted, although we don't actually have any evidence that he really said this or that extermination of bison was an official of Army policy. The only good Indian is a dead Indian is also attributed to Sheridan, but he denied that he said that.
So in this painting, it looks like we've got all these men on the trains going out west. Was train travel at this time actually the most popular way of moving west or settling? What did that look like?
Well, train travel was certainly popular for settling, and it was used to hunt buffalo or bison like this. However, it wouldn't be the normal way that the bison hunters would have been going out into the prairies to hunt the bison. They would be taking the more conventional means like a wagon or horses, mules, and so forth, so that they could reach where the tracks didn't even go.
And so, one of the things when we look at the men on the train, were there soldiers on the trains at this time, or what was their role when they were moving out west?
Well, there were a lot of soldiers who came west after the Civil War, men who had fought in the Civil War, and some of them, of course, were in the Army as part of the Indian Wars, but others were coming west just to seek adventure and a way to make a living. The soldier you see on this train is obviously shooting the bison, aiming to kill them as well. And they also might have had a role as a guard, perhaps, to help fend off Indian attacks, should there be any on the train.
And one of the other things I noticed, probably the piece that helps give this painting its name, I notice in the distance the storm cloud with the lightning.
Right.
What is that telling us, or what does that suggest about the situations and the escalation of the tribulations that we have at this time period?
Yes, if you look over on the left-hand side, you can see the lightning coming down, and it looks like a big thunderstorm. And overall, the clouds are very dark. And obviously, this is symbolic. David York is calling this the dark day on the plains, and it symbolizes that there is a very dark time to come for the American Indian. I mean, it wasn't very pleasant right then at this time, but it was about to get even worse with the near extinction of the bison and the arrival of hordes of settlers. The bison were not just food, but Plains Indians used them for clothing, for their teepees, for their tools and instruments. And so without the bison, they were starved for food and other resources.
And for our scholars, it's important to remember at this time, the Indian Appropriations Act was passed in 1851 that authorized the establishment of reservations. In 1860, the Bureau of Indian Affairs established the first Indian boarding schools, and parents were pressured to send their children to these schools. Students at the schools were expected to speak English, choose an English name, dress in American style clothes, along with numerous other requirements. Then in 1887, the Dawes Act was passed, dividing reservations lands and almost basically ended the reservation system. These lands were turned into allotments for farming or ranching, and the collective efforts of these acts were to assimilate or to Americanize the Native Americans into the mainstream way of American life. And in fact, it wouldn't be until 1924 that Congress passes the Citizenship Act, granting all Native American citizenship. And in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act reversed the Dawes Act and that policy of assimilation by restoring some of those reservation lands. So that's a quick review of our painting, Helen. So the next thing that we want to do is we've gotten some questions that were sent in to us. And so I've got a couple of the questions that were handed to me here, and so we wanted to kind of talk about those, maybe get a little bit deeper or maybe a little clarity into what we've seen. So we had talked about, you had mentioned earlier the bison and the numbers of bison and how many were being killed off, and we saw the images of the bison skulls in the pile and the remains on the ground. We got in a couple questions about, are there bison today? Are they still in the plains? What is that? What's the population today? What's that look like?
Well, there are still bison today, and they were driven nearly to extinction, but some Native American tribes and some ranchers worked to save a few so that they had a herd that they could then go back to, and we now have maybe 500,000 perhaps bison. I mean, nobody keeps an exact track, but compared to the millions, it's not much, but compared to 1,000 or fewer, it's quite a lot. And they don't wander freely around the plains like we see in this painting at all. They are found either in parklands or in ranches. Right now, a number of ranchers have cattle and bison together, so they are done as livestock, and when they are killed just like cattle, and you can buy ground bison in stores like Publix or Aldi or Walmart. I've seen it there, and it tastes pretty much like high quality ground beef. You can use it in any recipe for ground beef, make meatloaf or buffalo burgers. So it's there. And then we also have a number of parks where bison are preserved. And in fact, even at Paynes Prairie Nature Preserve that's just south of Gainesville, there's a small herd of bison. But if you really want to see them in their element, you should go out west. And Yellowstone National Park still has a herd of purebred bison. And there also are a lot of bison in South Dakota at Badlands and Custer Park and in North Dakota. So there are a lot of places where you can still see them.
All right. Some of the other questions, we have been talking about a bunch of different topics, but we mentioned the reservation system and the changes that were taking place because of the killing of the buffalo. And so what we were getting in is that, what do you think the adaptations, or what were the adaptations that Native Americans would have had to have made as they moved on to the reservations?
Sure. Well, the first and obviously important thing is they had to change their diet. When they could no longer have the bison to eat as an important source of their food supply. So they began having to survive on a lot of government rations, flour and other things that they were given. So that was a dramatic and less healthy change in their diet. They lost a lot of their way of life. I mean, the actual going out on the hunt and was a big part of the way life worked for the Indians and the reservation, and that was no longer there, so they didn't have anything to do in a way. I mean, their whole way of being and acting during the days and relating to one another was disrupted.
All right. And we mentioned a few times, each of us had mentioned a little bit about land. We had talked about land with reservations, we talked about the railroad cutting through the land and changing that, and so what type of land did U.S. officials set aside? What lands were set aside for these reservations or these allotments that ended up coming from the Dawes Act?
Well, they basically wanted to give the Indians the land that the settlers wouldn't want. So, so they would give them the land that was worse for farming, for example, even though then they did expect the Indians to take up farming to help support themselves. So it was less desirable land. And in fact, in some cases, the Indians were moved a second time because the land they were on became more valuable and the tribe was moved to a new location. So yes, it was not the best land.
Okay. So to make sure that we have got a time, we wanted to go to one more practice for you all. So you had the chance to look deeply at the painting and the chance to reflect on what it means for what you know about westward expansion and this particular time period. Now we want to challenge you all with just a few multiple choice questions. We're going to do this through a Nearpod. You're probably familiar with Nearpod, so those of you who are familiar with it are scholars. If you have the app, you can join there. Otherwise, you can go to join.nearpod.com, or again, you can use the Nearpod app. And we're going to give you a couple seconds to make sure you can join using the code X968M. Now, if you're worried about dropping the live stream or you're worried about switching back and forth between screens, it's okay, don't worry. We're going to show you the questions on the screen as well. We're going to give you a couple seconds to be able to log in before we get started with these questions. And then once we do, you'll have about 30 seconds to read the question, process the answer choices, and pick the right one. So I hope you'll play along with us at home. I'm going to give you another couple seconds to get to that point. All right, so our first question for you in our Nearpod, or for our little quiz, is what was the primary purpose for creating the Native American reservation system? Was it to remove Native Americans from desirable land, to prevent civil war among Native American groups, to provide Native Americans with more fertile farmland, or to help Native Americans secure legal rights and mineral deposits? So you should be able to see the primary purpose for creating the Native American reservation systems was to remove Native Americans from desirable lands. Let's move on to our second question. Which of the following was a goal of the Dawes Act of 1887? Is it assimilating Native American Indians into mainstream American life, increasing the size of Native American Indian reservations, promoting Native American Indian languages and cultures, or strengthening Native American tribal governments? Mainstream American life. That was one of the goals of the Dawes Act. And on to our last question for practice for tonight. The Homestead Act, the mass killing of the buffalo, and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad are most closely associated with what event? The rise of organized labor, building of the Erie Canal, northern migration of African Americans, or the decline of the Plains Indians? Probably easy tonight, but it was decline of the Plains Indians was the answer choice to that question. Now before we move on, I wanted to make a reminder to everybody that these questions probably felt pretty easy tonight. But on the end of course exam, you're not going to get questions in order of the time period or the content that we've studied. And so make sure as you review that you know the terms like Homestead Act, that you understand the idea of the killing of the buffalo or the Dawes Act, but make sure you can make those connections. If you think you need help reviewing, there's a place you can go that's always open and always available for you to review. It's called our U.S. History Review Center. Students or scholars, how do you access the Review Center? You log into your Clever, you click on the High School Enrichment Activities tile. You'll enter into that tile and you'll click on the Social Studies link, which will drive you straight to the U.S. History Review Center. When you get there, you'll be able to access tutorials and videos Currently, there's about 65 of those available for different benchmarks for you to practice with. We're also updating it with some additional Nearpod practice for vocabulary and some practice quizzes that you can use to test your knowledge in a more real-like setting. With that, I wanted to say thank you to Helen. I want to say thank you to the James Museum for bringing us in. Thank you, Helen, for sharing your expertise and helping us look at this beautiful painting, albeit with a lot of meaning that goes into it.
Thank you. And I hope everyone comes to visit the James Museum.
Absolutely. And a lot of those images that we showed tonight are from this museum here. I wanted to remind everybody that next week we'll be at our next stop in our tour, Night at the Museum. This time we'll be at the Tampa Bay History Center on Thursday, April 15th. I want to thank you all for joining us. I hope this quick review helps you on the EOC. We know you're going to do well. Keep on practicing. Good luck and good night, everyone.